Good morning. Welcome to CannaList. I am your host, Patrick Doherty, and we are talking with author David Paleschuck about his new book, Branding. Bud? Did I get? Wow, I was space that. Sorry, Branding Bud, which is the commercialization of cannabis. Sorry about that. David, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So, what led you to write a book?
Well, that's a great question. As I, entered the cannabis industry 11 years ago, I realized that I had more questions than answers were being given, and I thought the best way to, to search out the answers were to speak to, the folks in the industry that knew the most. And over the course of time, I started to capture that information and then actually went to work at Dope Magazine as the vice president of brand partnerships and licensing. And as I helped them, reshape the magazine, I started to write for the magazine. And my background for years at American Express, MasterCard, Pepsi, and Microsoft has always been in marketing and brand building. So I started to look at brands that were being created in the cannabis space. I started to write an article every month, a 3-page article called Branding Bud. And essentially after 28 months of writing 3-page articles, I realized I had enough content where I could start to roll that up into something that might capture what was happening in the market, in the cannabis space, in the developing brand landscape of the cannabis industry. And it seemed like there was a lot of people that were interested in that. So I created a book, and and it's taken a long time. And because things change so fast, I had to rewrite that book a number of times. But fortunately, I got it out, and it's on its way. It's got a life of its own now.
Yeah, my understanding, and you can fill this in for me, but you're number one in the category of branding. You're number one in the category of green on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yeah. For the book released on 4/20, and for the last 5. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, we had to.
Yeah, exactly.
But for the last 5 weeks, the book has been number one in in brand and logo design and green business on Amazon. It's pretty amazing.
And so, one of the interesting things that recently occurred is, was it High Times that's now moved into product?
Yes, High Times. Yep.
Yeah. So what do you think of that? Where somebody traditionally known as a publishing brand is now moving into product. What does that tell you about the industry?
Well, so I definitely have strong opinions on that. The first thing I'll comment on is when I went to work for Dope Magazine years ago. This was probably 7 or 8 years ago. They actually were coming out with their own product line as well at the time. And so coming in, working with the 5 founders, my first comment to them was, do you guys realize you're competing with your advertisers? Which they didn't realize. So the Dope Pen, which was Dope Magazine's vape pen, was a full-page ad on page 4, but their highest paying advertiser who had a vape pen was on page 44 with a full page ad. And so, that started to catch up to them. So hence there were cartridges, there was even the dope pack. And so my suggestion to them was, and what we eventually did was, you guys should not be developing products, but rather you can put your name on a product if you take the approach of Wine Spectator or Cigar Aficionado, where you are more of the purveyors of fine quality products and producer processors within different states. And so you're bringing them to the fore, and you're overlaying your name and working with them to call out the best product within each of the legal states. So that's how we created and took that program. But relative to where High Times is, yes, I just got two emails this morning in my box for, High Times CBD products. I don't think that's a smart strategy. I think they're competing against their potentially their advertisers, and on a side note, I don't often say things like this. I think High Times has other things to focus on, like going public, which they've tried to do many times and have not successfully done. So, so this may be their plan B. Come up with a line of products, but I don't think it's a smart strategy for a publication to come out with a line of products that competes with their advertisers.
I mean, I think the challenge is that being a publication is tough, right? That market in general is tough. So they just might be trying to diversify their, because that is such a challenging industry.
That's true. And even further, they used to do the High Times Cannabis cups, and both for for rules and regulations, as well as mismanagement of the events, and a pandemic overlaid on that. So the pandemic was just the nail in the coffin for the events. So if you don't have events, you're in the publishing world, you're trying to go public, there's been a number of missteps. It's creating a CBD product or potentially even a D8 product or something like that might be the way to go, because that's what's selling now.
And from a branding perspective, I'd like to sort of talk about CBD a little bit, and about sort of, the fact that the market was overridden by companies making claims that they should not legitimately be making, right? Where, touting what this product could do without any, scientific evidence to support that. Can you speak to that a little bit about, how is, branding and, the idea of being able to trust a brand?
Well, I mean, trust is everything, right? I mean, at its core, a brand is a promise and the ability to fulfill that promise consistently. That's what a brand is. So, I mean, let's just talk about the industry for a moment. There's so many people coming into the industry, both on the THC side and on the CBD side. And I think a lot of the folks that came into the CBD industry were the THC companies that rushed into their states, but then realized there was both a lot of competition, a lot of taxation, and a lot of limitation, and a lot of capital needed to basically build a national brand. So as these THC companies were doing that, and all of a sudden realizing, like, wow, this isn't going as fast as we thought, we're not making as much money, federal legalization isn't happening. If I want to move to another state, either I have to build new facilities in that state, or partner with somebody, or license my brand. So I think what happened is, after the Farm Bill passed, I believe a lot of THC companies said, hey, why don't we get into the CBD business? And so you had a lot of small companies that were really underfunded, trying to get into the national business. And those folks, quite frankly, don't know very much about what the FDA expects or demands from products in the market, with different, constituent components. So I think there were just a lot of people that didn't really know how to play fairly. And I also think, the FDA was caught a little off guard in terms of, wow, how do we manage this? There's so many brands in the market, they're selling everywhere. How is this happening? And so there's, the FDA, has sent out a number of, I'll call them cease and desist letters, basically, as well as warning terms of false claims and things like that. So, there's been a real reorganizing of the industry, and I think I'm actually speaking on June 12th at the USA CBD Expo in Atlanta, which is the largest CBD show in the US. So that is sold out. So I think everybody is finally coming back, and everybody's ready to get on board again. But yeah, there's been a lot going on in the CBD space. Not only on the brand level, but also on the manufacturing level, and sort of the big glut in hemp here in the US. But coming back to your question, it's difficult. It's difficult for brands to consistently deliver a promise when rules and regulations are changing, and when they're maybe perhaps not the right companies to be delivering a product in a way that consumers have always been used to receiving a product.
I mean, I think that you could almost say that across the industry, beyond CBD, even in cannabis. Because what we saw in the green rush was a lot of people assumed that they were going to make a lot of money. So they chased after business with little or no experience in the cannabis industry, without an awareness of the tax implications of running this type of business, the penalties, the compliance issues, those types of things. So this idea of all these companies rushed into this space, assuming there was this green rush, with little or no real understanding of the industry.
That's true, and so I see that in two directions, really. You have entrepreneurs that are coming into the industry that have no clue about the culture, the product, the rules and regulations, and then you also have growers, legacy growers that have been growing for decades. They've never had to brand their product. They've never had to market their product. They've never had to package their product other than in a baggie. They've never had to transport their product in ways that they need to now.
And they never dealt with compliance.
That's right. The tracing and tracking and the seed sale. So there are, when you think about it, there's really two groups, which, working both ends against the middle, trying to figure out how to create an industry. And it's been really, I hate to use the word disruptive, but the industry hasn't been, well, I guess the industry has been disruptive, but the internal components of the industry, there have been battles between, suits and stoners and hedge funds and the like, in terms of, how to develop brands, what brands are meaningful to cannabis consumers, who are cannabis consumers. There's all these things that are taking place now, conversations that are taking place as the industry develops. And it's just really intriguing. Which leads me to one thing that I often sort of share in the middle of conversations when they tend to get heated about cannabis. Often the conversations I participate in, people talk about the plant, and they talk about a plant, and typically they are a legacy cultivator. So they talk about a plant in a way that there's so much love and there's so much passion. And then, on the other side of the table, there's an investor, and that investor is saying, but what about the beverages? And what about the transdermal patches? And what about the sublingual slips? And what about the edibles? And what about all the other things? And that's where I kind of come in and say, hey, there will always be a place in the industry for the plant. And in many ways, let's even call that a craft industry. There'll always be that. But once THC, CBD, CBG, CBN, all the other cannabinoids are extracted from the plant and become distillates or isolates, or essentially an ingredient that goes into another product. That's a whole other conversation. And I actually feel that that will be a different market, if you will, and in some ways, maybe even different industries, if you will. THC or cannabinoids will only be an ingredient in those products, but it will just be something completely different. It will be a different industry. So I believe there'll be an industry based on flower, and then there'll be an industry based on cannabinoids. And the industry based on cannabinoids, those will be multiple industries that are using cannabinoids as an ingredient in their products. And so I think that's how it will start to, I think, for example, let's say Pabst Blue Ribbon, who is already in the cannabis infused beverage game in California, they're not having the same conversations that a flower producer or a farmer or a cultivator is having. They get their product, it's sourced in, they pump it in to their product, they carbonate their product, and they ship it out. And when it becomes federally legal, they're going to sell their Pabst Blue Ribbon cannabis infused sparkling seltzer in 7-Elevens and in convenience stores and in gas stations right next to the other PBR. So, which is going to be a different channel and a different type of product than flower. So in my opinion, as things further develop, there really will be a bifurcation of cannabis flower versus all the other types of products or form factors that contain cannabinoids in them as an ingredient.
But couldn't you also say that about flower itself? Because what we have is we have a medicinal market and we have a recreational market, and those are considerably different, right? The way that I'm assuming, and you're the brand expert, but the way that you brand to a medicinal client or the doctors is considerably different than when you're looking at a recreational product.
It is. It is. So the differentiation there would be, for me, the way I look at it is, I have a couple of different spectrums, if you will, that I look at brands. So in this case, I have a spectrum which is additive and subtractive. So additive is, will this product enhance my experience? It often tends to be more aspirational and recreational. Then there's a type of product which is subtractive. That's, I need to alleviate the pain in my back or in my joints. That tends to be more medicinal. And so, I often sort of look at brands on that spectrum as well to sort of determine, how to market and how to build the content around that, and the messaging and the tone. But at the end of the day, yeah, you're right. There will be medicinal consumers that consume flower, and there will be recreational consumers that consume flower. And even though that's the flower side, and they will have different messages, pumped to them, so to speak, or pushed to them, because it's flower, there will still be some basic similarities in what we talk about. So that would be terpene. Well, it would be THC levels, right? It would be terpenes. It would be all the other things that you talk about when you talk about flower. And I think those really translate to both a recreational or adult use consumer versus a medical patient. I think those are similar conversations. They might vary in that this particular strain helps me with my particular ailment, whereas a recreational or adult user might say, this particular strain helps me focus and allows me to write or to paint or to, be more creative, or perform better at certain things. So I do think there are conversations, both medical and recreational, with flower, but I think there are very different conversations when they start to break out and cannabis is a an ingredient. And I think over time, that ingredient will also be mixed with other ingredients, of course, and other health and wellness ingredients, for example. So maybe it's cannabinoids in cardamom or turmeric or other things. But a friend of mine who's in the industry and has developed a number of well-known products here in the US recently said to me, the entourage effect just doesn't stop at cannabis. The entourage effect is something that that we live with every day. If we, that different things affect us in different ways, and if we have those affecting us at the same time, that there's a compound, or there's it's not just the 1 + 1 = 2. It's actually 1 + 1 = 3, because there is this entourage effect. So it's interesting to see that people are now looking into other things like other health and wellness components or ingredients that they could start to mix with cannabinoids, like mushrooms, for example. That's something very big right now. Looking at mushrooms and seeing, and when I say that, not necessarily psychotropic mushrooms, but just mushrooms, and the study of mycology mixed in with cannabinoids seems to be a big trend right now. But that too is the entourage effect, and how these components work with one another within our body.
One of the things that comes to mind also is, from a branding perspective, if you talked about a cannabis user 10 years ago, you had a stereotype of what that person looked like, right? And today, we have seniors using it for pain relief. We have health and wellness. There's CBD products that for people for going to the gym and enhancing that. And like you said, there's some of the entourage effects for some of the other things. So our user personas have changed, have they not?
Absolutely. And it's funny, you just said a moment ago, cannabis users over the years have changed, and now I use the word use, but I use the word consume and consumers instead of users, because even that in many ways is a stereotype. But yeah, absolutely. There was just a new study that came out about customer segmentation within the cannabis, or segmentation within the cannabis consumer, and that was really intriguing to see, how people are consuming, how newer consumers are consuming different than older long-term consumers, and how, as people pass through different generations, they too are consuming differently. Some of the older generations where they tend to smoke cannabis are now, moving away from that, using tinctures, using pills and capsules, using sublingual slips, or bombs or topicals to basically alleviate and relieve some of their pain. So, and at the same time, not only are they changing form factors, but they're also, dropping some of the other medications, non-cannabis medications that they've been taking along the way, and they're looking for, for substitutes.
But these new personas are, they require a different way to look at branding, do they not?
They do. And it's interesting. I sort of have my model, which I look at canna consumers, but like I think about it in, if you think about it in 6 concentric circles, right? The way I basically have it is, I've got the canna core in the middle. The canna core is the group that consumes almost every day. They eat, sleep, and drink cannabis. They're most likely in the industry. They're aficionados. They're connoisseurs, or cannasseurs in this case. The next ring out of that is the canna comfortable. They consume every so often, and or have friends that consume often, and so they're not taken aback by it. They're not threatened by it. They don't mind the smell of it or the effects of it. And then there's the next ring out, the canna casual, which is just a little bit further out. Again, They may have some experience, maybe they consumed in the past, but they don't currently consume now. They're still looking into it a little bit. The next ring out from that, I call the Canna confused. And those are the folks that, they can't figure out if CBD is psychotropic. They don't really know if they want to jump into the pool. They're not even quite sure if they want to put a toe into the pool. They're interested.
They think they're going to get high from CBD.
That's right. That's right. And then after that, there's kind of neutral. They just don't care about it. And then the further, the furthest ring out is the Canna Contra. They're against it. So now, if you start to look at that on a really high meta level, you can really break it down and you can say, well, how do I talk to these people? The Canna Contra, maybe I don't bother with that person, or maybe I educate that person. The outer rings are more about educating. The inner rings and the core are more about engaging in conversations, because the level of knowledge is there. So I kind of look at consumers at its most basic level, on that level, and those concentric rings. But then when you start to really get into the persona, you can have a kind of curious person that's a soccer mom, or you can have a kind of curious person that is suffering from arthritis. You could have many different types of personalities and personas. So let's even break that down. Often where I start is, and actually regardless of the ring that they're sort of falling into, is, are they a discrete user or a discrete consumer or an indiscrete consumer? And what that will tell me is their need state, their ritual patterns, and a whole bunch of other things. And by that, I mean, if they're a discrete consumer, let's just say they're a soccer mom, they want to consume. More likely than not, they are either alleviating, let's say, stress or pain or anxiety. If they want to consume throughout the day to control these ailments, they'll most likely microdose. Then I get into the, again, discrete versus non-discrete. If they're a soccer mom, they're not going to, light up a joint. Or if there's somebody on their—
They're going to be sensitive to the smell.
That's right. Or they're not going to go out at lunch and smoke a joint and come back in so they smell, like weed, and everybody says, "Gee, what'd you do at lunch?" But so there are these different needs and needs within their need states and the rituals that they typically surround themselves with. So in the case of a soccer mom, and again, I'm absolutely creating a stereotype here, but so if a soccer mom is dealing with anxiety, she might want to microdose, and she might want to microdose in a discrete way. So maybe that's a mint, where she could take a 2 milligram or 5 milligram mint every couple of hours and she's fine, and nobody knows the difference. That might be a lot easier than even having a vape pen for her, or she could use a sublingual slip and put it under her tongue, or maybe she would put a transdermal patch on and keep it on all day. And it looks like a Band-Aid to everybody else, but she's getting her her dosage in the correct way, and she's managing her pain and or anxiety. So, so that's really how I see different personas really figuring out how best to consume. It's both the form factor. It starts off with discrete and indiscrete, but then it gets into the form factor. Once you start to think about the form factor, then you can get into the bioavailability and the means of uptake, meaning, am I smoking it? Am I eating it? Am I drinking it? Am I rubbing it on my skin? And then you can start to get a handle on what the uptake and bioavailability is, therefore your dosing, therefore your the amount of times that you take it to benefit or alleviate the issues that you're looking to alleviate. So there really is a directional course for people to figure out the best way for them to consume cannabis. And even more so, because we're talking about branding, there really is a way for brands to develop meaningful products that are correctly dosed in the right form factors, that have the right messaging for the particular consumer, and overlaid with a brand archetype and a style that appeals to that consumer. So that consumer not only gets the product they need, but it's delivered in the form factor they want, in a message and tone and look and feel and language that they understand. And as long as the brand can deliver on that and consistently deliver on that, then they'll have a loyal customer.
And what do you think about, when we think of examples where branding has gone bad, or people have used branding, the thing that is sort of popping into my head in the recent weeks is there's been a lot of, I think it's either lawsuits or just general pushback from large candy companies, where some of these cannabis companies are, making knockoff type products based on the candy structure, right? And there's been a considerable pushback. What's your response to like companies that do that?
What's my response? Well, because we're being recorded right now, I can't give you my true response, but so I'll tone it down a little bit. Okay. So let's just start off with basic business, right? Let me even back up. I understand the trend in the cannabis industry to move toward strains that have had different either candy related names or dessert related names or sweet pastry type names that stems from Sherbinski and gelato and mochi and all the other strains that have, wedding cake and all the other things that have come about. On top of that, there are strains, that have been named after candy, Skittles in particular. It is, I believe, what you're referring to. And in the past, there have been things with Gorilla Glue as well. So this is not the first time this has happened. So this is why I react the way I do. I'm appalled at the absolute poor business judgment by any business owner, cannabis or non-cannabis, to create a product that infringes upon somebody else's trademark. So let's just start there. It's just bad business. Secondly, it's dumb. You're going to invest in a name and packaging and all these other things that it's just a matter of time, and it was, before Mars Wrigley comes in and says, hey, here's your cease and desist. You are not going to use our name. Oh, and by the way, in this case, Mars Wrigley is not only advocating for that, but they're actually, they want possession of Terpogs is the company that's being sued. They want possession of the Skittles website domain that Terpogs is actually currently using, which I believe has a Z in front of it, or one letter which differentiates it. But now what's interesting here too is Mars Wrigley and Bo Wrigley has just created a company called Parallel. And so they're into the cannabis industry too. So, a lot of the cannabis industry folks are saying, oh, they're just doing this because they're getting into the cannabis industry. Well, that might be true, but the truth is,
they're protecting their brand. Yeah, they're protecting their asset. Yeah,
that's right. So it might be additionally true they happen to be getting into the cannabis industry. But as a brand owner, by the way, just newsflash, I just got a High Times product email come into another High Times product email come in. But the point here is that they should not be doing this. They should not have started a brand. They should not have started, it's clearly trademark infringement. And, quite frankly, whatever they get, they deserve. And shame on them for not creating a brand that speaks to consumers, their consumers, in a way that they could have protected it and just built their brand. Now they have to start over, right? It makes no,
yeah,
or they're done,
yeah.
but it makes no at all. And it's, I hope this acts as a lesson to other brands. You know, we saw the strain Gorilla Glue go from Gorilla Glue to GG. You know, so there's a lot of GG strains in the market now because of it. So it's interesting, and trademarks will only become more and more of an issue as you know, as more brands come on and brands become federally legal.
And from a branding perspective, what's the biggest challenge that most cannabis, that the cannabis industry is facing?
Well, from a branding perspective, you know, I almost want to say, number one, brands don't necessarily know who their cannabis consumers are, but nonetheless, they've taken shots in the dark and said, hey, our brand stands for this, so we're generating a brand, and if you resonate with it, come back, you know, be our customer. And some brands have done that really well. I mean, the Cookies brand is a great example of that. You know, it started off with Burner and rap music and Jigga doing genetics behind the scene, and now has grown into both a you know, a multi-platform brand, which not only has stores, but has big apparel lines that they not only sell in their stores, but in other major, you know, chains. So they've connected with their consumers in a way that other brands have not. But I think the biggest branding hurdle, I would say, is, so when you start let's just use an example. I'm going to use the 420 bar as an example. The 420 bar was developed in California in the legacy market by Marco Hoffman. He brought that to market through the Venice Cookie Company. Then he started Evergreen Herbal up in Washington State. And he quickly realized that the dosing requirements, the packaging requirements, the labeling requirements from California to Washington were very different. Then he had success in Washington with the brand, and I came in and started to help him license that brand to other states. So we licensed that 420 bar to Alaska, we licensed it to Massachusetts, we licensed it to Arizona, and a few others. But let me give you an example, and this is why it's difficult. So the 420 bar in Washington has a ceiling of 100 megs of THC. Each serving is has a cap of 10 megs of THC. So what you have in Washington State is basically a bag of chocolates that have 10 pieces individually wrapped, that have 10 megs in each of those pieces, with a cap of the total bag at 100 milligrams of THC. Mm-hmm. That's the rules and regs in Washington State. Now we license that to Arizona. Arizona has different rules for dosing. Excuse me. So their rules are 50 megs per dose, with a cap of 300 in the total package. And so what we ended up doing is we transformed our bag of 10 meg pieces into Arizona as a bag of 6 50 meg pieces. Now, what that starts to do is that changes the molds. You know, so the dosing have already changed. The molds for the chocolate has already changed. The packaging that it goes in, plus the different child-resistant packaging and wrapping. So when you start to roll through, wow, this product was this in this state, but now the dosing has changed, the amount of tranches or pieces within a bag or within a bar demarcated has changed, the mold has changed, then the packaging it goes in, all of the call outs, all of the rules and regulations, and I could keep going, but you get the idea. And this happens within each and every state you move your brand into. And not only that, you can pretty much almost assume that with each and every state, every 6 months, they're going to have some sort of re-up on the rules and regulations. So if you bought too much packaging, you're just out of luck. You've lost your packaging if they start to change. So you really have to play it. You almost have to do just-in-time inventory. You have to manage the different states. You have to see where there are economies of scale and where there are differences.
But it also, there's another problem, and that was, you led with branding is about consistency. So if I travel and I buy this product in different states, I'm not getting the same product.
You're exactly right. Now,
and doesn't that undermine the brand? Because the experience differs.
Well, so yes and no. I'll use this analogy. Yes. Does it differentiate the experience from state to state, wherever that brand is? Absolutely. And I could even go even deeper. If we talk about flower for a moment, the top 10 strains in Seattle are not the top 10 strains in LA nor in San Diego. And because I had worked in the beverage industry for many years, one of the things that became clear is the sweeter the beverage, it typically appeals to either a lower socioeconomic demographic or one that's closer to the equator.
I was going to say going south. The sweeter the beverage, the further south you're going, right?
That's right.
Right.
And so, let's take Coca-Cola for example, and Mexican Coke, which is cane sugar.
Yeah.
I prefer it over the American Coke. But there are those nuances.
That's a killer buzz, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
you get a sugar buzz.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's just different. It's a different experience, yet similar. It's always, I've always collected, like Coke cans from around the world and Coke bottles. So I've always been interested in those nuances, but at the end of the day, you're right. Your experience of the 420 bar in Seattle or LA will not be the same as your experience in Arizona. And so, that's where the brands right now have to be really mindful of what can they make consistent, right? How much of these moving parts can they make consistent? And so one perfect example was as the brand manager for the 420 bar, when it was licensed into Arizona and they were starting to launch it, I went down to Arizona for the launch and everything went well. I came back to Arizona about 3 months later to just look at how they were manufacturing, making sure that they were following the SOPs, again, leading toward this consistent delivery of a brand promise. And what I noticed was the pouches that they were selling the chocolate in were the pouches we had mandated. But what they did was, we in Washington and California, we have labels, front and back, two separate labels. What Arizona did was they took one label and they wrapped it over the top and they said, look at us, look what we did. We're so smart. We saved 50% on labels. We're saving 50% on labels because we only have one label instead of two. And I said, good for you, but that's not in line with our brand. And you have changed the brand packaging. And, I slapped them on the wrist and I explained to them that is not permitted in our brand license. For them to change things, that the concept is to keep things consistent and similar. And to the extent that we have all these other moving parts like dosing and packaging regulations in different states, we need to keep whatever we can consistent as we can, because we need to, basically get to the point where upon federal legalization, that experience of a 420 bar in Seattle is the same as it is in Phoenix, as the same in Los Angeles. But yeah, that absolutely is rolled up into the ability to create a consistent experience, which is a brand.
And when you wrote the book, what were the takeaways that you were hoping that the reader would get or come away with?
Well, there's a number of different takeaways. So I think first and foremost is this is a plant and it's been completely misunderstood. That's number one. Number two is the absolute baggage surrounding the plant when it came to Harry Anslinger during Prohibition, the connections between Harry Anslinger and, Hearst newspapers and the Weyerhaeuser family, and how hemp and paper pulp competed against each other. There are so many reasons why cannabis and hemp were prohibited, and it has nothing to do with cannabinoids. It has everything to do with, with the competition between hemp and paper, and the newspaper companies, Hearst in particular, and Weyerhaeuser, and how they all schemed to basically, put hemp out of business. Right. And so I think that's probably the first. Is it's a very misunderstood plant. Second is really about prohibition and why cannabis has been made illegal. Because once people start to understand that, they realize, and I do not and often don't subscribe to conspiracies, but there were so many connections between Harry Anslinger and his wife and her family and so on and so forth. So I think that needs to be known. But what that did, Prohibition then created stereotypes. And those stereotypes started off in the 1920s with, cannabis in the fringe, cannabis dens up in Harlem, jazz.
When did Reefer Madness come out?
I'm sorry?
When did Reefer Madness come out?
I believe, I want to say either in the early 20s or the late 1910s or early 20s.
I mean, that's a propaganda piece, right?
Absolutely. And that was also part of Harry Anslinger's propaganda. So, this all came out, and it was totally racist. It was, when black men smoke cannabis, they rape white women. There were unbelievable things that were said during that time, all coming out of Harry Anslinger's office, which was really the precursor to what the DEA is today. Mm-hmm. But what this did is then created the stereotypes around jazz, around moving from jazz into, now moving further later into, what became of hippies, the beginning of Cheech and Chong, the following things that sort of came out of that, whether it was Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Up in Smoke, Pineapple Express, the Vietnam War, Just Say No to Drugs. I could keep going, but it was just this onslaught of falsisms about the plant, about the people that consume the plant, and what absolute garbage and derelicts they were. And so with that, I wanted to change that. So that was a big part of it. Once I kind of get through that, I also talk about cannabinoids, the basics of THC and CBD, how they affect us, terpenes, how they come into play, the entourage effect. Then I talk about form factors, helping people know that there are different types of form factors. Not only is there flower, there's all the extracted cannabinoids, which come in the form of waxes and butters and oils that can be vaped or smoked. Then we get into edibles and beverages, even innovative products like sublingual slips and transdermal patches, topicals and lotions, pills, creams, that type of stuff. So I talk about the form factors and how the body takes them in, means of uptake, and then the bioavailability. And then finally, after that's all laid out, I then talk about brands. And I talk about the 14 cannabis brand archetypes, which appeal to customers, which I then get into. In the 14 cannabis brand archetypes, they're not mutually exclusive, but they can overlap. But very at its very basic. There are cultivator brands and foodie brands and health and wellness brands and counterculture brands and charity brands and gender brands, novelty brands. There's all types of ways that brands appeal to consumers. And then I break it down into who are cannabis consumers. And I try to break down finally the stereotypes, because I think it's important for people to realize when they're reading the book that there's many types of consumers. Again, as we discussed earlier, some are patients and use medicinal cannabis, and others use adult use recreational cannabis, but they're wide and varied. Just like if you asked who drinks beverages and what type of beverages, it can be anything from milk all the way through to alcohol. But it was that overall picture that I was trying to create for people that were new to the industry, for people that were even in the industry, for people that are interested in cannabis, for investors that want to know more as a grounding and a foundation, and then get a sense of who some of these brands are, some of the leading brands, and why they're successful. That's a long way of giving you the multiple reasons why I wrote the book, but I felt there was a need for it at this time. And in the end, the book turned out to be the first book on cannabis branding ever written. So I think there's lots of interest in branding in general, and certainly now in cannabis. So I think the time is right. And I guess, its position on Amazon, is witness to that.
And what do you see looking forward? How will this continue to evolve? What would be some of your predictions, for how this will evolve?
Well, as we move closer toward federal legalization, which I believe will happen, we move closer to normalization. And as we move closer to normalization, big, larger consumer product goods companies come in and start to incorporate and use cannabinoids in their products, whether they are specifically cannabis products or whether they are other products that have cannabinoids in them, like, Procter & Gamble comes out with a Crest toothpaste that all of a sudden has CBD in it. It will start to normalize over time. Banking for all these companies will start to be normalized as well. The companies will start to grow. They'll be supported by, big corporations. There'll be insurance for people that work at these companies. There'll be, all the things that normalize, and a new industry will develop out of this. And it will become part of what I believe will be, the existing CPG industry. Some of those companies will invest, some new companies will come about, there'll be aggregation like there always is, but I believe we're on the road to normalization, and cannabis will be both something for recreational use and for medical use, and we'll see that manifest in those ways that we expect to.
Yeah, I mean, to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, one of the things that we are concerned about is as these big players begin to move into the space, they will change the nature of the industry, right? This idea of, a mom and pop dispensary, it will be at jeopardy, because when tobacco decides it wants to be in the industry, right, they will go in big, they'll have economies of scale. When pharma decides it wants to come in, you know what I mean? So one of the challenges is, as it normalizes, it risks being taken over by big corporate.
That's true. There is a risk, and I'm actually one that I'll say it outright. It will happen. It will happen. I do think there will be carve outs and places where either regulated, there are means to keep I'll call it people from the legacy market still in the industry. So there'll be rules around that. For example, Colorado now has just increased, Denver has just now increased the number of licenses that they're allowing. and those licenses are specifically in neighborhoods of lower, of inequity, I'll say.
Yeah, the
So
social injustice licenses.
that's right. So there'll always be that. There'll be a place for that. And I absolutely think there'll always be a place for flower. And I think flower will probably sort of play in that world more so. But I do think, look, I live in America. This is the American way. Do I want it to happen? That's a different question. Do I think it will? Yes, I do think it will happen. This is how America works. And I believe there will be a part of the industry which will be taken over by alcohol, pharma, and tobacco. But I also think there'll be another part of the industry, whether you want to call it craft, whether you want to call whatever it ends up being.
Yeah.
I believe the industry is mindful enough to keep a place for the legacy players. But there's no doubt that will be challenged by pharma, alcohol, and tobacco. And my hope is that they can play together and both succeed.
Yeah, I mean, we have a similar belief that, it is the craft model where, if you look at craft beers where, people who be willing to pay a premium to know it's organically grown, knowing that, where it's sourced from, that, there's a living wage. So, hopefully that craft component will allow the legacy element to continue.
Right.
So,
And I truly believe that will happen. There's too many people in the industry, both actively participating and at the lobbying level to just fully allow pharma, alcohol, and tobacco to come in and just level everything that's been built. I don't see that happening, but I do see them coming in and taking a piece of it, no doubt.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in Europe, we've seen big corporate come in and take over, right? So, a lot of the Canadian companies came in and, secured the licenses for countries. You know what I mean? And so that, local couldn't participate and, local couldn't compete with that. And then on top of that, you have, again, economies of scale so they can grow bigger, faster, and cheaper ultimately.
Right.
Which will impact, the deliverable to the market, the price structure and all of that. So we've seen it here.
It's interesting. There have been a number of conversations that I've participated in, or at least listened in on Clubhouse, where they talk about the quality of flower in Canada. Well, they talk about the quality of flower in Canada versus the US, and they say there's no comparison, that all of the big companies do not grow the quality of flower that the US does. But on top of that, they also talk about how black market growers or legacy growers in Canada are the ones that are actually growing the quality cannabis, and that this is a big issue for the Canadian market now, because those that are interested in flower and quality flower, they're still purchasing on the black market and not purchasing through the regulated market. So, so there is a movement about the economies of scale and the robo grows that they've been called, and so on and so forth, not producing the quality of product. But it's interesting. It's definitely, again, I think that's the same conversation. It's like there are some people that just absolutely are into their craft beer and they would just never drink a Budweiser because it's just not up to their taste level. And
Pabst Blue Ribbon.
Right. There you go.
Right. Yeah.
So it's intriguing, and I think we'll see the same segmentation across the board. And even further. I mean, just in beverages right now, you see Can, which is just killing it in terms of marketing and promoting. Ellen DeGeneres just spoke about Can. She's an investor. She just spoke about it on her show. So they're coming in the market at 2 megs of THC, but then you've got other companies like Major coming in with 100 megs of THC. So clearly there are there are many, many, many different types of cannabis consumers, and you could even see that just in the product offerings. Why would someone buy a beverage with 100 megs and someone would buy a beverage with 2 megs? It's a 50-time difference. It's just insane. But there are those different types of consumers.
Yeah, the people who drink Monster, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Not to digress, but the one area that I think we might have skipped over that I'd like to visit before we end this was, and you brought it up with Ellen, is this idea of the cannabis celebrity and as a brand. I think Martha Stewart has a line. I know that Cheech and Chong has a line. Jay-Z's coming into the business.
He's in the business.
Yeah. So, I mean, and the list, the laundry list of celebrities and, Mike Tyson, I think, right? So what's, what is the celebrity brand and why is that an attractive factor?
Well, it's not for me. I'll say that. And
but it's to somebody, right? Because I mean, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it.
It is to somebody. I don't know how long that's going to last. I just don't. Sure, we've seen this in the alcohol business, right? George Clooney and so on and so forth. Everybody's got a tequila brand and that sort of thing. But I think it's the same thing. And there's different types of celebrities. Now there's cultivator celebrities, like Sherbinski, which if you're really into the cannabis industry, you'll understand who Sherbinski is. But if you're not, and, Mike Tyson appeals to you, which
why, I don't know, but okay. Yeah. If he does.
Right. Well, and he may appeal to you as a boxer, but how does he appeal to you as a cannabis entrepreneur and connoisseur? I don't know. Jim Belushi makes that same claim. I could go down the list. They're all there. Seth Rogen just came out with Houseplant and was on Stephen Colbert's show just this past week talking about Houseplant. So, when you have the late night show on CBS and Stephen Colbert having his guests talk about his new cannabis company, we've and Ellen speaking about it on her show, we've truly arrived at a very new place within the last couple of months. So let me speak to this for a moment. I like celebrity brands only because they get celebrities talking about cannabis, which gets the average person interested or on edge in some way, their interest peaked relative to cannabis.
Yeah, because they're going to reach people that may not have otherwise been reached. That's
right. So all the folks during the middle of the day at home watching Ellen DeGeneres, now she's talking about, hey, you got to check this new product out. It's really great. Me and my friend Chelsea Handler had a great weekend, with my girlfriend or wife Portia de Rossi, and now all of a sudden it's like it's a big celeb fest, and they're all saying you should try this. That makes a difference. So from my perspective, that helps the industry. But is it really about what brands are? No, I don't think so. I have never been a fan of endorsements. I have never been a fan of endorsements. And I've seen endorsements go bad in so many ways. David Beckham endorsed so many products that nobody even remembered what brands he really stood by. Or I don't know.
I used to live in Chicago, and basically the thing was Michael Jordan, if you paid him, he would endorse anything.
Right, exactly. And there's that. And then I don't know, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, what celebrity went off the deep end and took a brand with them? Right. Multiple brands have experienced that. So
yeah, where they have to distance themselves from the celebrity who's created some faux pas, right?
So tying a brand to one person is just, in my opinion, it's a very risky business strategy. It may get you eyeballs initially, but at the end of the day, if it's that person's brand, that's
Yeah, I think Tiger Woods would be a good example of this.
there you go. That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And fortunately, he's been able to come back. But yeah, that's exactly right. So I just think there's other ways. There's other ways to promote brands. Again, many of the archetypes I spoke about earlier. There's charitable brands. I mean, there's a brand called Farmer and the Felon, which is made by CannaCraft. One of the owners of CannaCraft spent 6 years in jail. He came out to create the largest cannabis company in California with multiple brands, CBD, Care by Design, Farmer and the Felon, Hi-Fi Hops, which is a collaboration with Lagunitas, which is owned by Heineken. So, this guy came out as a felon, is cutting deals with Heineken and Lagunitas, but created a brand that gives back to the Last Prisoner Project,
right,
that really fosters some great things happening in the industry. So I think there are brands that can do things like that. There are gender-based brands. There's a whole bunch of other ways that brands can sort of really do things other than paying another celebrity, half their investment to be the face of their brand. It just seems just so unnecessary.
Well, David, we very much appreciate your time. Remind us of the title of the book again.
The book is called Branding Bud, The Commercialization of Cannabis.
And where can we find it?
You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Books A Million.
And if we want to learn more about you, where would we go?
I have a website, brandingbud.com, which talks about the book, and my consulting firm, Paleschuck, can be found at paleschuck.com. And again, that's a long last name, so that's PALESCHUCK.com.
And it'll be below, so we'll make sure. So again, we very much appreciate your time. It was an enjoyable conversation. We learned a lot. We recommend you go out and read the book and get a little bit of the history of how we ended up where we are today. And we will love to have you back, and we'll have this conversation in a year, and I guarantee it'll be completely different.
I totally agree. I look forward to that conversation.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate it.